Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project. Thank you so much for being here for today's event, which I am extremely excited about, and we are calling Building Local Power to Confront Corporate Dominance, Lessons from City and State Leaders. Over the last few years, there's been major momentum at the state and local level to find new, innovative ways to challenge corporate power. State enforcers filed major antitrust suits against Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Dozens of communities nationwide passed new laws to protect local businesses from predatory delivery app platforms like Uber and Grubhub, and several states are rethinking their antitrust laws. One of the most exciting things that happened is the New York State Senate in June passed the 21st Century Antitrust Act, which, if it became law, would be the most significant update to antitrust law in a generation. That's why we're so glad to have that bill's Senate sponsor, New York Senator Michael Gianaris, here delivering a keynote address today. I'll return to Senator Gianaris in just a minute, but I also want to recognize the other great folks who will be speaking later. We'll have a closing keynote from Washington, D.C. AG Carl Racine, who was the first Attorney General to bring a case against a tech giant, Facebook, several years ago, and subsequently brought a second case against Amazon. So very grateful for his leadership there. And we'll also be hearing from an absolutely fantastic discussion with Florida State Representative Anna Eskamani, Illinois State Senator Robert Peters, and Maritza Silva Farrell, the Executive Director of Align in New York. I also want to recognize my colleague and the Director of Economic Liberties State and Local Program, Pat Garofalo, who will join us later as well and is doing the work of 10 anti-monopolists to help support and advance action at the state and community level. Just today, he's released a fantastic toolkit for state leaders who want to join the fight to rein in big tech. So check that out after the program. Now, before turning it over to Senator Gianaris, let me just say a few words. So going back to the debate over Amazon's HQ2, which centered on questions about how much influence community members should have over their own economy, the senator, alongside scores of everyday New Yorkers, has been leading the way in working to put communities ahead of corporations. From my vantage point, the amount of political courage and the degree of deeply held progressive values it must have taken to upset the Amazon machine is truly inspiring. And the long shot, hard-won victory of New Yorkers over Amazon, of David over Goliath, fundamentally changed the trajectory of the anti-monopoly movement. So it is no surprise that his subsequent work is to ensure that New York's antitrust laws are able to meet this moment of hyper-concentrated corporate power, which has had significant negative effects, not just on the state's economy, but on the ability of New Yorkers to choose the government they want. New York has historically been at the center of efforts to rein in corporate power, and it's great to see that attitude alive again in Albany, and not just on antitrust, but on economic development, labor, and a host of other policy areas. We really hope New York continues to set an example, not just for other states, but the federal government to follow. And with that, I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Senator Gianaris. Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you, Sarah. And let me thank all the attendees and, of course, AELP for the great work that you continue to do. We'll get into it as part of this discussion, but you've been an invaluable resource as we've developed this proposal and moved it through our state legislature. Still have some work to do on the Assembly side, but getting it passed to the Senate was a pretty significant step forward in terms of what we're doing. So I have a fair amount of time. So what I want to do is give some background on how I got to this point, how we got to this point, what kind of led us here. You touched a little bit on the origin story of my involvement. I'll get into that, and then we'll get into the meat of the proposal and why it's so significant. And why we're doing it at the state level instead of waiting for Congress or lobbying them to do something similar. And so probably the one thing I'm best known for, if anybody knows me for one thing, it would be that, yes, Amazon's HQ2 was supposed to come to my district, and it is not coming to my district. And I think that was a positive development given how awful they were to deal with, how bad that deal was, and what it would have meant for these neighborhoods. And so that was one thing. You mentioned the courage it took. The press at some point reported on what they call the burn book that Amazon had, and mentioned that I was the leading participant in that book. So they definitely have me on their radar. And they can be a very scary company, and that's what we're really talking about. Is the incredible power they've amassed stretches well beyond just the business world. They assert themselves politically. They assert themselves in ways that, frankly, become very dangerous for our democracy. Because we have this belief that decisions of government should be made by the people who elect their representatives, and they act accordingly. But out in Seattle, when the city council tried to do just that and impose a head tax for very large companies like Amazon to help deal with their homelessness problem, Amazon spent millions and millions of dollars in city council races to try and defeat the individuals who were behind that. That's just one example. Obviously, everybody knows that they put the entire country through a contest where localities were engaged in a bidding war just to have them agree to put their offices and their workers in their cities. And that was really the heart of the problem that I and so many others had with what they were trying to do in Long Island City, Queens. And just by us asking the right questions, they decided to pack their bags. And so that tells you a lot about how they view the world. They think, and in many cases, they are unfortunately correct, that they have amassed the kind of power that allows them to dictate. And if they don't get their way, they believe they could just move on and somebody else will bend to their will. The fact that they have this kind of power is the problem. And this is not all about Amazon, by the way. I mean, it's a very high profile company, the highest profile, of course. But there's a lot of companies, especially in this changing economy, where this kind of power exists. They suffocate smaller and medium-sized businesses. It's an interesting debate about this antitrust issue because you hear from opponents that we need this freedom to abuse, essentially, in order to innovate properly, when the opposite is true. If we don't have small and medium-sized businesses given the latitude to operate freely, to grow and to develop their own ideas, we're actually stifling innovation, not encouraging it. And that's where we've landed. That's why we had a public hearing on this proposal last year. And one of the strongest supporters of the bill was Yelp, right? And companies like that are well known in the tech space, and yet feel like they can't operate because the big boys are just squashing them at every opportunity. And so we put this bill in with the help of so many people. I see Maritza Farrell here from the line is on this call as well. She's been a tremendous help as we've moved this legislation forward. Had our hearing on it last year. We passed it through the Senate earlier this year, and now we're working on getting the Assembly to also lend its support. We're not in session now until the new year, so this is a 2022 project at this point. But I understand that the advocates are making significant progress in the Assembly and gathering supporters, and hopefully we'll get to the point next year. The Senate repassage should be a matter of course since we've already done it. If we get the Assembly there as well, then we're really in business. And this would be nothing short of a revolution in the way we handle antitrust issues in this country for a number of reasons. And that is why so many people have taken notice, and all of a sudden the lobbying efforts that normally would be directed at Congress are focusing more and more in New York. Big business is displeased. It's funny that some of the things that they say in opposition to what we're trying to do are the very reasons we're doing it. So they will tell you, you can't do this. This will completely upend the way we operate and antitrust is enforced in this country. And to that, I say, absolutely, that's exactly what we're trying to do. So we agree on the effect of what this proposal would do. They just don't like the consequences because they appreciate the more laissez-faire attitude that's developed over the decades in this country. And we're trying to set the tone in New York that we've gone off the rails. The concentration of power, market power, and other power in just a few small hands is not the way things are supposed to be. Decisions are not being made in the interest of the public, but in the interest of these profit-making entities. And the problems that flow from that are pretty obvious. And so just to give you one kind of example that's been harped on the last few months, if we were properly, and I'm going a little bit off topic here, but indulge me for a minute, but if we were properly taxing these companies in ways that they've been avoiding for the last several years, we could get those resources and use them for public good. What's happening instead is this money stays in their pockets and they're financing trips to the moon or orbits around the Earth. And God knows what else. What a tremendous waste of billions of dollars that could be used to help people in need, to help make decisions in the best interest of the public. And unfortunately, because of the very concentration of power that we're discussing, that those things are not happening. And so let me get into the meat of the bill a little bit. There's a couple of things in it that are kind of low-hanging fruit and easy from a New York perspective, and then there's the part of it that would affect the market all across this country. And so a part of this bill just brings New York up to speed. We haven't changed our antitrust laws at the state level in over a century. And what does that mean? That means our penalties for violations of our antitrust laws are grossly inadequate. So we would propose capturing those up back to essentially the federal level. So we would increase the penalties significantly so that there would actually be potentially a deterrent and not just the cost of doing business. So I'm looking down as I'm checking my notes here. So we would increase the fines for violations from what is currently $100,000, which is pocket change for some of these companies, to $1 million for individuals, and from $1 million up to $100 million for corporations. That is in line with federal rules. We would also increase the criminal penalties up to a Class D felony, which is actually still even slightly less than what the federal penalties are in that respect. We would increase the statute of limitations from 3 to 5 years, which again is in line with federal antitrust laws. So on the penalty side, we would bring New York's laws in line with the federal laws and kind of capture us up that way. Another big way we would do that is this notion of unilateral conduct. Federally, you can pursue a regulatory action for unilateral actions of a company that would be monopolistic, right, or in violation of the antitrust laws. In New York, we require two parties. We require a collaboration before an action can be brought. So we would remove that requirement and get us again in line with the federal government in the sense that New York's regulators can bring actions for unilateral conduct. And that is something that we're seeing more and more as the economy has changed and the laws have not changed to catch up with it. It's no longer just a collaboration to price fix or what have you amongst two parties, because these individual entities cross over so many markets that they're able to leverage their dominance in one to affect another. And so, for example, if somebody controls a search engine, but also selling products that search engine points you to, it's not hard to imagine how unfair that is. And that could be a unilateral action by a company that is only revealing its own products or prioritizing its products in the search results as opposed to competitors. And so we would allow unilateral action to now be subject to the regulations in New York. So that's the pieces of the bill that capture us up to the federal law, but the federal law is pretty inadequate. And part of that is the laws haven't provided significant teeth or significant modernization to capture us up to what's happening in today's economy. And the other is court decisions over the years have whittled down the ability to enforce these laws and made it so difficult to successfully bring an action that they are effectively toothless. And that is probably the biggest piece of what we're trying to do that would change the antitrust approach throughout the country, is we would change the standard that under which actions can be brought to what is known from a monopolization standard that currently exists to what's known as an abuse of dominance standard. It's a standard that exists throughout much of the world, Europe most notably, but other large countries have been following this abuse of dominance standard. And it allows actions to be brought in broader cases. It allows the example I just used to be pursued by the regulators. And so it would, again, this is the one where people say, well, now you'd be changing entirely what it is that we do in terms of antitrust. And again, I say, yes, that is in fact what we are trying to do, because the law and the decisions interpreting the current law have effectively given us no real enforcement and allowed this incredible concentration of power to come to bear. And so the bill goes through a list of things that would be considered abuse of dominance, conduct that tends to foreclose or limit the ability or incentive of one or more actual competitors to compete, such as leveraging a dominant position in one market to limit competition in another. And it goes through a number of examples, but the idea is we're trying to capture new conduct that is revisiting an old problem. And so that is what it's time to modernize our laws to get at this point, and that's what we would attempt to do. We also would have it relate to labor markets in the monopsony context, which is critically important because now these employers are so omnipresent that they tend to be dominant even as purchasers of labor, and then our workers have no ability to adequately negotiate for a fair wage or benefits or what have you. And so this bill would also allow actions to be brought when these companies are so dominant in the employment context that they also not limit competition, so to speak, but limit the ability of the seller, the worker, to get a fair benefit for his or her wages, for his or her work. I'm sorry. And so those two things would create a drastic change. And again, those who fear change will tell you that, well, wait a minute now, we don't have specific guidance as to what this means. How would we function? My answer is we function exactly the same way you did 100 years ago when antitrust laws were created, and there wasn't any guidance then. And the courts went through and started putting some meat on the bone specifically in specific cases. It's nothing to be afraid of. It's just something that we need to do to make sure that the laws are working the way they're intended. We would give a fair amount of power to our state attorney general as well to help provide some guidance in specific contexts. We would give regulatory power to the attorney general and with legislative oversight, so they would be able to issue regulations in terms of how the new law would be interpreted and enforced, and through that rulemaking authority, give some more certainty to the players in the marketplace in terms of what they'd be able to do, what they wouldn't be able to do. Importantly, though, we're not just ceding this authority to an elected official without input from the lawmakers, from the legislature. So either house of the legislature would be able to supersede or reject a proposed rule by the Attorney General in this context within 60 days of it being issued. And so there would be some level of oversight there as well. But in response to the suggestion that we weren't providing enough guidance as to what these laws mean, we have a mechanism for that guidance to be provided and for the legislature to oversee that process. And so we think that's a good way forward in terms of both giving the law room to work and room to breathe, but also providing some guidance to those who would be affected by it in terms of what would be required. We get into some more, and I know I'm kind of running out of my time already. I can keep going on this for a while, but we do also provide some additional requirements for pre-merger notification. It's a long-standing practice at the federal level that mergers that are proposed have to go through an approval process. We do lower the threshold for what would be required to receive that kind of notification here at the state level, because anything over a certain threshold is already covered by the feds. And at the state level, you're really dealing with smaller mergers and things that might fall through the cracks at the federal level, where they're only looking at the very large mergers. And we would provide a private right of action also for individuals to be able to bring action, so we're not relying only on one official and the ability of their office to bring these actions. So look, this is a lot. We know it's a lot. It's intended to be a lot. And for those who think things are going just fine and are succeeding in this world, they don't want to see anything along these lines happen. I get it. Those who have been successfully making money and increasing their market power and their political power like things just the way they are. But this is the public standing up and saying, we don't like things the way they are, that this is a dangerous situation we've encountered. And the only way forward is for elected leaders to stand up and change the laws so that we can properly deal with this crisis. It's only going to get worse until something happens, because the more the power in these corporations grows, the harder it's going to be to do something like this, because their ability to influence policymaking will also grow with it. And so this is the time to do it. The question has been asked why, and I know this is the point of the whole day, is why states need to step up and do this. I would just say there's some good representatives, good legislators in Washington trying to do good work on this issue. But if we're going to wait for Washington to solve this problem, we may be waiting a very, very long time. And so there's a great history in this country of states serving as laboratories, stepping forward and providing solutions that then can be exported to other states and then eventually adopted throughout the country. New York is in a unique position to do that, together with California and some of the other larger states. I think it's time that we step in and take a stand for small and medium-sized companies, for workers, for the general public. And that's what we're attempting to do here. This approach has worked very effectively in terms of auto emissions. I would say we need to go farther, but we have an emission standard that was created by one large state in California that has now become a national standard. So it is the history of this country that states step forward and lead the way when necessary. I would suggest this is one of those times, and I'm incredibly appreciative of all the help and support we have from everyone who's participating on this panel and so many others. And my commitment is to follow this through until it's done. So hopefully that will be early next year, but we need all your help to get there. So thank you all again very much. Pat, thank you as well. I see you on there for your leadership. And Sarah, I'm going to take it back to you.
Sure, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us today.